A misplaced modifier is fairly easy to explain, but spotting one is sometimes harder. So we'll first just explain what it is, and then we'll do a bit of practice to get better at finding them in a sentence. A modifier then is anything that describes. So a modifier is description in a sentence. And that description can be simply an adjective or an adverb, but it can also be something bigger, like a clause or a phrase. And if we look at our first example then, I started dating Kate, a friend of Sarah who has the most beautiful eyes. You can see that this last bit here is kind of misplaced. So who has the most beautiful eyes? This is called a relative clause. A relative clause, and it starts with a relative pronoun here, who, and that relates some extra information. So this whole clause then is a modifier. It's telling you about something else. And in this case, it's telling you about Kate, even though it seems that it's telling you about Sarah. And that's actually the problem. When we have these kinds of relative clauses, they tend to refer back to the thing that is closest to them, which should be Sarah. But in this case, obviously, we mean that who refers back to Kate. And that's why this is misplaced. We want this clause to be much closer to the real object, or the real thing that's being described here, which is Kate. So the problem then here is that we have this apositive phrase stuck in between, and that's causing all the trouble. It's delaying this final clause. There are some ways around this. So for instance, you could say, I started dating Sarah's friend Kate, and that would already bring Kate right next to who, and that would solve the problem. But there are other ways to do it as well. So you can just rearrange the sentence to make sure that the clause and what it modifies are right next to each other. The next one reads, I read about his fraudulent behavior in the bathtub. In this case, we have a phrase here at the end, and this is a prepositional phrase. And the prepositional phrase is presumably describing I. So I was sitting in the bathtub reading a newspaper, I suppose, and then, you say, I read about his fraudulent behavior. The problem, of course, is that in the bathtub, this prepositional phrase seems to be describing the last thing, which is the behavior. So is this behavior in the bathtub? Is that what's fraudulent? Doesn't quite make sense, does it? You can fix this again by just moving things around, and you could say, for instance, while I was having a bath, I read about his fraudulent behavior. So really just try to make sure that your modifier is as close as possible to the thing that it modifies. The next one reads, 2 Chinese ladies stopped my grandparents selling their aphrodisiacs. Again, we have this final bit here, and this is also a phrase, but this is a participial phrase. Participial phrase. And there are quite a few more phrases and clauses that cause trouble. We're not going to talk about all of them in the video, but the main thing here is just to recognize these kinds of patterns where you see that one piece of the sentence is too far removed from what it describes. And this participial phrase sounds like it's describing grandparents, but it's supposed to be describing these 2 Chinese ladies. And again, we want to move it closer to what it's describing. The final 2 sentences here are trickier because they contain a single word that might be in the wrong place. And even then, sometimes you can argue about whether it needs to be moved at all. In the first one, we read, German shame about the Nazi years affects their collective psyche still. This last word, still, is really modifying affects. It still affects. So I think it would be better to move it closer to affects. Right? German shame about the Nazi years still affects their collective psyche. It's not terrible to have it at the end, but again, we want to think about what it really is modifying and maybe move it a little bit closer. And then the last one shows one that's very tricky and a mistake that pretty much all of us make at different times. So this one says, during our time in office, our government will only raise taxes for the wealthiest individuals. And the problem is this little word only. In fact, of all the misplaced modifiers, this is probably the most common and the trickiest one to watch out for. So if you say, we'll only raise taxes for the wealthiest individuals, what is only actually modifying, right? What is it modifying? Is it the raising taxes, or is it that you're raising taxes only for the wealthiest individuals? And the latter is actually the case. This only really should be, if you want to be grammatically correct, should be after raising taxes. Raising taxes for whom? only for the wealthiest individuals. Because what's otherwise implied is that during our time in office, our government is going to do only one thing, right? We're only going to raise taxes. And that's about it. We're not going to do anything about other reforms or make other changes. We're just going to raise taxes. That's it. Now that's maybe expressing it a bit too strongly, but you can see here what is meant, that only sounds okay, but it really should be a little bit further in the sentence. That's it for misplaced modifiers. We'll do another video just with a bit more practice, but hopefully you get the concept, and try to do some exercises on the website to get better at finding these kinds of mistakes.